So let's pick up where we left off. The second primary response state is a level of tension we refer to as power. Now, as a reminder, look at where these perceptions come up that give rise to these levels of tension. So you're looking at the change grid diagram. There are two axes we look at primarily for revealing the level of tension. The lower axis is the perceived level of ability. Ability ranges from a low of 0 to a high of 12, and the upper axis is perceived challenge, also ranging from a low of 0 to a high of 12. Now, in order for someone to end up in power, which is this big highlighted meaty one in the middle of the change grid, they need to be reporting some sort of balance in their perception. So we'll start flipping through and looking at some key indicators to look at, but just kind of be aware of that. If we look at these two scales, these two dimensions, when people are reporting some level of balance, that's how they end up here in power. So the situation that gives rise to power is someone's level of ability and the level of challenge are in balance. They do not have to be absolutely equal. So if you look at the change grid diagram for a second, you can see that if I was at, well, here we'd be at 2, 2, there's 3, 3, there's 4, 4, 6, 6, 8, 8, 9, 9, 10, 10. They don't have to be exactly in balance, but as long as there is a relative balance between those two perceptions, people are going to end up in the power response state. Now, power sounds like this. I know I need to do something, but I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet. So I'm going to look at the options, consider the alternatives, weigh out the relative merits of the different ways I could go, and then I'll make an informed decision and move forward. So power is a very interesting level of tension because it's the level of tension that triggers us to consider, evaluate, or to put it into consumer terms, to go shopping. This is where we look at options. This is where we explore possibilities. Now, obviously, in your work as coaches, you probably spend a good deal of time with your clients in this power response state. So they've presented whatever the issue happens to be that's compelled them to engage your services. And you're at this point in your work with them where you go like, well, let's look at some options. Let's see where we could go. That whole section of the discussion that you're having, that whole stage of the work that you're doing falls into this category of power. Now, ideally, for your client to do this consider shop sort of process most effectively, they need to be in power. So that isn't at all to imply that the moment you say, well, let's look at your options, your client is automatically in power. You could have a client who's way up in stress, as we talked about a few moments ago. And up in stress, they may start to look at options, but remember, stress is characterized by very reactive decision making, emotionally ruled reasoning. So when it comes to options, they view their resources as being tightly limited. Again, you can look at your reference guide to see these characteristics laid out in a matrix kind of form. But up in stress, this is hardly the place where people are going to do a very effective job of identifying options, let alone exploring those options. So again, stress is characterized by people grabbing hold of a life ring. And even though they can be surrounded by so many options, that doesn't mean they can see them, acknowledge them, understand them, weigh out those relative merits. That level of tension, stress, is too much to allow the client to do that effectively. So in order for the client to do that effectively, we need to do whatever we can do as coaches to lower their level of productive tension to a more beneficial level for that particular task. And as I've already said, that would be power in this particular case. Now, certainly as the course goes on, you're going to learn how to effectively manage someone else's level of tension, that is, raise it and lower it as the need arises. But just kind of know, as you're looking at the change grid for the first time and developing an understanding of what this diagram is saying to you, there are certain things that happen most naturally at certain levels of tension. So rather than trying to push somebody who's up in stress into doing option exploration while they're still up in stress. That's not a match. Let's see what we can do to move them to a healthier level of tension. So a lot of good things are happening to support them in this effort. So let's take a look at a few more of these characteristics of power. So just like stress had a set of emotions associated with it, so does power. But there's a big difference. The emotions that we found up in stress tended to be of the unresourceful variety. Again, we're not casting a value judgment about whether that emotion was good, bad, right, or wrong. We're just saying that certain emotions tend to distort reality, tend to feed upon themselves, and perhaps go from a problem to a bigger problem because of the magnification that so many of these emotions have on someone's perceptions. Well, in power, the emotions tend to be more of the resourceful variety. And the two we tend to look at most are pride and confidence. The person who's in power feels a good sense of self. So they believe that they are who they are and that they can do what they can do and they've got what they've got and they know what they know. And so there is this kind of level of knowing that they have about themselves and what's available to them, etc. So they're coming into whatever this activity is that is happening in power, plotting in power, with a more resourceful sort of mindset. And we'll talk about their exact availability of resources on the next screen. But they're coming into it going like, no, I've got it. I feel good about myself. I feel good about the position that I'm in right now. So hopefully you can hear there's a sense of confidence there. Also, there is this element of pride. Pride is feeling as though you are good, you are doing good things, you are in a good place, you are behaving in a way that is responsible and perhaps even noteworthy. So we're not talking about pride as in arrogance. As you learn more about the change grid, you will learn where arrogance lives on the change grid. But we're talking about the level of pride that helps you with self-esteem, that helps you see your value, see the value in others, etc. So it's a healthy kind of a pride that helps you to feel in control, as you'll see on the next screen. Now, resourceful emotions are emotions that help to enhance our ability to see a situation more clearly and to do things that are more appropriate based on that assessment. So these emotions, pride, confidence, tend to help us in that endeavor. Now, reasoning abilities are also affected by being in power. In the case of power, reasoning abilities become more logically ruled. Remember again, or look at your reference guide there, that when someone's up in stress, reasoning tends to be emotionally ruled. So they figure things out, and again, that's in air quotes for those who can't see through the grand power of the internet. These these individuals are reasoning something, they're figuring something out by tapping into gut level feelings, instincts, and intuition, which could pull them in the right direction, could distort things again because of the emotions that are happening up in stress. Well, when we get to power, reasoning abilities become more logically ruled. People in power have a natural tendency to seek out facts and figures, to understand their situation in very concrete, measurable ways. And so things tend to be a little bit more reality based. Now, that's not to suggest that they aren't feeling any emotions. They are. They're feeling proud and confident and on top of what's going on. And perhaps it is those emotions that allow them to focus their cognitive abilities, the left brain sort of functionality to look at a situation and figure out what's going on. Now, the decision making that happens in power tends to be very proactive. So someone who's in power is actively looking for a solution that makes sense today in this moment, but also serves them well in the future. And so they have a bit of a more long-term sort of perspective about whatever is happening there in power. Also, in power, someone's perceived availability of resources is impacted. Now, someone who's up in stress thought that the resources were scarce, virtually non-existent, and perhaps they truly were. But again, because people up in stress are suffering from a distorted reality, they could have been surrounded by all the resources they need most. But that level of tension was negatively impacting their ability to see those resources and tap into them. Certainly in your role as coaches, you have spent many conversation with someone who believed they had no resources available to them, even though if they were able to emotionally separate themselves from the situation, they would see that resources are anywhere and everywhere. Obviously, in your work as their coach, you help them to reconnect with those resources. And although you probably weren't aware of it at the time, what you were actually doing was lowering their level of tension to a place on the change grid where they do have the ability to see those resources more naturally. So, because again, if they were still up in stress, their ability to see those resources would continue to be very difficult. Whatever it is that you did and however you did it, you were able to lower their level of productive tension, or more accurately, you were able to help them lower their own level of productive tension down to power, where now they were able to see what was going on. So I like to say to all the new students, we're talking about tension management. You may never have known this, but you've been at least attempting to effectively manage other people's levels of tension all along. We're here to give you a little bit more of a structure, a science, an understanding of how this technique of tension management can actually be better understood, more effectively deployed. Now, the person who's in power, well, back to resources, the person who's in power believes their resources are adequate. That means they believe they have enough. They don't believe they have an excessive amount. That's elsewhere on the change grid. They don't believe they're scarce. They believe they have enough. And if they are thoughtful and prudent about how they go about using those resources, they'll be able to take care of what needs to be taken care of. All will be good. And, they might even have a little bit left over. So adequate resources. The person who's in power is feeling very much in control of whatever the situation happens to be. So remember, in the nature of change, we said that people are either feeling in control or out of control, and this idea about gaining and maintaining control, seizing control, is a very important aspect of this whole tension management approach. So someone who was up in stress was feeling out of control. In power, they feel in control. Now, looking at productivity, productivity is, am I getting things done? Am I moving forward? Is progress happening? So when it comes to power, productivity is generally very good, but as you'll learn in a moment or two, there is a downside, and it does negatively impact productivity. But generally speaking, people in power are pretty productive. Going back to stress, they were counterproductive. Lots of activity up in stress, but that activity was not well focused, was not well managed, and as a result, there was a lot of false starts, a lot of energy, a lot of activity, but activity and productivity are not necessarily the same thing. In fact, up in stress, we said people could be counterproductive. Well, in power, we're in a good spot, good level of tension, productivity is generally quite good. Dave, any questions, comments from anyone so far?
No, so far so
Okay,
good.
so far so good. All right, so now um, when you come to actually using this concept, and again, there are times when we are using tension management, they will actually have people use an instrument that reveals their level of productive tension. The vast majority of time that you are using these principles in your work, it will be what we call off-grid. You're not really using the change grid as a formal tool. You might not even be using this change grid diagram, but in your head, in your understanding, these principles of tension management are always going to be coming into play. So how do you go about determining that your client is in power without the benefit of an assessment? Well, the truth is that you are already all fully equipped to understand what level of productive tension someone is experiencing just in your natural interactions with them. Just like in stress, we talked about physical, tonal, and verbal cues that let us know that the person was up in stress. There are also physical, tonal, and verbal cues that let us know the person is in power. So physical cues are built from postures, gestures, facial expressions, breathing rate, and attire. So what does someone physically look like when they are in power? Well, they tend to be very balanced in their postures. So they tend to be seated upright. They tend to be, if they're standing in a more upright. They're not slouching. They're not moving around frantically. They look very balanced in what's going on. So let me slide that out of the way. That was interesting. Um, the gestures that we are looking at tend to be very deliberate. And the best example I give of deliberate gestures is when you're boarding a flight and they're giving the safety announcement, and the flight attendant says there are two doors, and they're using their hands to gesture, two doors here, two doors there. And everything is very deliberate, very calculated, very purposeful in the use of gestures. Facial expressions tend to be very controlled. So the person who is in power is perhaps more aware than any place else in the change grid of what their face is doing and what their face is communicating. In fact, if you wanted to be a highly skilled and successful poker player, you'd better spend your time in power, because otherwise you could be giving your tells, you could be communicating messages just because of very subtle changes in your facial expressions are very deliberate ones, where if I'm in power, I could deliberately display a facial expression of an emotion I am actually not feeling, but I want someone to think I'm feeling. So as you work your way through a deeper understanding of the levels of tension, I can also tell you that if for whatever reason you wanted to be a highly expert manipulator slash liar slash whatever evil intention you might have, you need to be in power, because in power you have absolute control over all of those attributes. Breathing rate is normal. That's normal for that particular individual. And attire looks normal. That may not make a lot of sense right now, but we said last time around, if someone was up in stress, they tend to look very disheveled. So because their level of tension is consuming their thoughts and perhaps their emotions, they really aren't given all that much thought to how they happen to look. And so, but they look kind of disheveled. Someone who's in power looks put together. So the tie is straight. If people are still wearing ties, they look really put together. It's all good. So you can tell just by looking at your client where they are. Now, obviously, as conversation goes on, the mind goes to other issues. Those other issues may carry a very different level of tension. And as they move mentally into those other issues, you will watch them physically change as well. So it all goes together. What's happening with our physical, emotional, intellectual activity, that's what our level of tension is. As our physical, emotional, and intellectual activity changes, as focus changes, we will also move around on this change grid. It happens continuously every single moment of our existence. So now, how about some
Hey,
tonal cues? Yes, Dave.
T, I just wanted to highlight what you said about the off-grid use of tension management. I think that's a really important concept. And what I found is the more you understand the change grid and get all these things down about the change grid, you start seeing it in your head. And it becomes like a lens you look through no matter where you are. And you don't have it physically in front of you, but it's in your mind. And it's really powerful.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, a lot of the people that are on our call now, many of the faculty members have joined us during the discussion session. I'm sure they'll be sharing lots of examples of how they go about using these principles of tension management without looking at a grid or without even bringing up the existence of a grid. And once you really do understand and you've internalized these concepts about tension management, you just walk around daily life and you find yourself going like, well, aren't they up in stress? Or okay, got to be in power if I want to get all this done, so it starts to become part of the fabric of the way that you live and work and play.
Exactly. Now there was a question on the last slide, T, about the attire, and you kind of
Yes.
addressed this a little bit about what normal means, and I guess we need to know the context of the situation to define that, right?
Well, and it's normal for that individual. So, if we are, let's say that we're having a business meeting with someone and they arrive and they look absolutely polished. Everything about them is spot on the way it should look. So hair is right, makeup is right, the outfit is right, the shoes are shiny. I mean, everything is absolutely put together. All right, well, I know this for certain. That person is in power at that particular moment. Um, when they sit down, if they are seated upright and they've got their hands interwoven in front of them, and it's all this very deliberate sort of way, I know they're in power. That's very important. But now let's say a conversation begins, and as their conversation begins, suddenly they start playing with their hair and mess that up a little bit, or they're loosening their tie, or leaning over to one sort of side. I know that they are leaving power and moving elsewhere on the change grid. And so these cues, some of them are very subtle, some of them are blinding flashes of the obvious, um, are indicators of what's going on with someone's level of productive tension. As you become more and more expert at your understanding of tension management, you will see that on the change grid, you may not have done the math, but there are 169 addressable locations on the change grid, and every one of them looks and sounds ever so slightly different than any of the neighboring spots on the change grid. Okay, so back to tonal cues. If you can't see them, then the physical cues really aren't going to be all that available to you, or so not all that useful to you. So what are we going to rely on if we're just talking to one of our clients? Well, the tonal cues are volume, tempo, pitch, affect, and inflection. These are the things that their voice is doing other than the words themselves that are telling me where they are on the change grid. So someone who's in power, now again, you're going to see the word normal and controlled. It's always normal for that person. So, and there are regional differences, there are cultural differences about what normal may mean. So as a quick example, um, I come from a very quiet family who grew up in a very quiet environment in a very quiet part. And so for us, normal is really very, very quiet. Well, if I was living in the hustle and bustle of a huge city, that could be normal could be defined in very different ways. So you do have to factor in a little bit of that environmental, cultural kinds of stuff to kind of know. So not everybody comes from a very quiet culture, not everyone comes from a very, quiet sort of environment. So you just have to figure out what's normal for that person. That being said, volume, how loudly they speak, it will be normal for them. Tempo, how quickly they're speaking, normal. Pitch, where are they at on the whole scale of musical notes? Where are they? Normal for them. Affect is about accent in your voice again. So um, to what degree is someone's natural accent being displayed? Up in stress, the natural accent is going to be predominant. If someone is trying to display a different accent for whatever reason, up in stress, that becomes very difficult, perhaps impossible. But when they are in power, they have a tremendous amount of control over their affect. I'll give you a quick example of this to know what's going on. Long ago, my wife and I had a foreign exchange student from Germany. Her name's Sita. And when Sita arrived, she got off the plane and she spoke to us in absolutely flawless American accent. I heard zero evidence of a German accent. And so at first I thought, okay, is this even CETA? I mean, wow. Well, we learned, she was with us for, many, many months, that if CETA got upset about something, her ability to display an American accent flew by the wayside, and suddenly this German accent was very, 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 very prominent. So it's just about saying that when we are in power, we are able to tap into a lot of different skills, a lot of different abilities that we may still have, but we are not able to tap into as effectively elsewhere on the change grid. And there are places on the change grid where actually it would be impossible to do some of the things we're doing. Anyway, affect is about accent in someone's voice. And then inflection is the range of dynamic that happens in there. Are they flat and monotone? Are they up and down like a roller coaster? How much inflection are we really hearing? Now, there are also verbal cues. Verbal cues are just looking at the words themselves. So when it comes to power, grammar is very good. So people are putting right things in the right order in the right places. They tend to have the largest vocabulary they personally have available to them in power. So you hear them using a lot more interesting words perhaps, or just perhaps more academic a sort of a vocabulary being used versus what they may sound like elsewhere on the change grid. Jargon and slang, they know they can stop it. They're aware of a term that may be jargon or slang, and they can in the instant choose to or not to use those words. Filler material is the sounds people give you to listen to while their minds are thinking about what they want to say next. So it's all the ums and ahs. And predicates, as we talked about last time around, are words that imply that a particular sensory system is being used. And so up in stress, we said people tend to become very visual in their word choice. In power, they become very auditory. So listen to this. How does that sound to you? That's music to my ears. These are the kinds of predicates they might be using to indicate to you that their auditory sense is being tapped into. And yeah, so that's how we know they're in power. Now, the last thing to look at about this response state in all of them is what's the upside and downside. So first of all, let's look at how does this fit in practically to what you're doing as coaches? Well, as you're working with a client, their level of productive tension is constantly being impacted by what they're thinking about, what they're hearing, what they're saying, whatever's going on around them. In order for us to be the most effective as we can at helping them, we need to know what's going on with their level of tension so we can help them to be at a level of tension that's going to serve them most effectively for whatever the task is at hand. And likewise, we always want to make sure that we are equipping our clients to become more effective in their own life. And so anytime we can help them to understand what's going on with their own level of tension, how to recognize what's going on with their with their own level of tension, or perhaps even how a level of tension impacts their understanding of a particular situation. This is very valuable for you to do. So let's say that I'm working with a client and we're talking about a particular issue and they understand the levels of tension. I could say to them, now, if you were in stress about this situation, what might you be saying? What might you be feeling? How might that affect how you are working towards your desired outcome? Well, what if you were in power instead? How would power affect your ability to see what's going on, make decisions, follow through, and do that? And so I think it's really very powerful for you to transfer your knowledge of tension management to the individual client. And that's again why all of you as graduates of this program are given the ability to gift to any and all of your clients or prospective clients a course in personal change management. It's called Mastering Personal Change, and it allows them to learn the principles of tension management for self-application. As part of that, they get their own personal change grid that they can fill out and they can look at whenever they want, and you could actually then give it to them as a homework assignment or pre-work or follow-up work to whatever the work is you're doing with them. So as we start to work our way through the program in greater detail, we'll be playing with that personal ChangeWorks system, so you can see how that all fits in. So point of all this is that you want to be using these principles for your own understanding. You want to transfer this understanding to your clients as well. Last thing to look at for power is what's the upside and what's the downside. Well, at this point, certainly sounds like power is all upside, doesn't it? Sounds like it's all a very beneficial, great place for people to be. And truly, more often than not, it's a wonderful level of tension for people who are trying to explore options, make high quality decisions, and move forward from there. But there is a downside, and that downside is that people get stuck in power. If you think about the clients you've worked with, no doubt you've had your fair share of clients who are more than happy to spend multiple sessions looking at different options, exploring possibilities, talking about all the what ifs that could be out there, and that can be a very useful, interesting, even vitally important part of the work that's being done. But if that's where they stop, if all they ever do is look at options and explore the possibilities, but never implement anything, then nothing is really going to change in a substantial sort of way. People can get stuck in power. You all know about analysis paralysis. So people can get stuck because looking at options feels very safe compared to now choosing one of those options and implementing that option. So no doubt, even as I've been explaining this, many of you right now recognize that you have clients who are either right now stuck in power or have a tendency to get stuck in power. So there needs to come a point in time where we say, enough shopping, considering, evaluating already. Are we at this point of choosing? Are you ready to choose? What's the choice? Now what happens? So that's the downside of power. People do get stuck there.
So T, when you're talking about being stuck in power, are you saying that you need to get to a different level of tension to take action?
Absolutely, because as long as someone is in power, their primary desire is to have as many options available to them as they can explore and understand. Now, usually to move someone out of that mindset, we're going to need to help them boost their level of productive tension, not all the way up to stress, but you see there's a level in between. We got to get them that in between place. As you learn a little bit more about tension management, there is a possibility that someone in power will still take charge, will still drive it. So we'll be talking about the two places on the change grid that change actually occurs. We'll certainly get to that, but absolutely right. They need to spend some time in power in order to make that quality decision. But then the question is going to be, are they taking action now, or are they continuing to delay taking action pending the availability of more information? So people in power are in an aggressive information gathering mode, and we have to help them understand when is there enough information to make the best decision and move forward from that. Okay, so that's power. All right, so let's look at the
Great, thank you.
next. Uh, the last of the primary response states is apathy. Now we talked about stress way up at the top. We talked about power, the big meaty one in the middle. Now we're going to talk about apathy, the wedge at the bottom. Now again, looking at the perceptions, in order to end up in apathy, you have to be in a situation where you perceive your level of ability as being far greater than the level of challenge requires. So To be in apathy, you would probably be listing your ability as, well, generally it's 6 and higher, but it's really about the challenge being 4 or lower. If you use this, and by the way, you don't need to use this numerical scale. As I said before, in conversation, we often just say to a client, well, how would you rate your ability? And they might just say, well, low, it's pretty good, it's pretty high. We need to be able to translate those words into certain spots along this range. So even if we use low, moderate, and high, that'd be at least a 3 points of distinction along this axis. Maybe they go, well, it's low, or it's moderately low. It's there's some there, but not much. No, I know a moderate amount. I'm okay. Well, I'm pretty good at it. I know most of what I need to know. I know everything. Well, now I've just created a 5-point scale. So you just have to use your natural ability to translate words that imply a place along a scale to the place on the scale. The great thing about the change grid is that it's useful whether we are using very simple descriptions of levels, or we can get super, super fine tuned. And if you think a 13-point scale, again, 0 to 12 is 13 points. If you think it seems like a lot, we've had plenty of clients, particularly those with scientific backgrounds, who will say, oh, my ability is like an 8.5, it's a 9.75. It's like they try to turn it into even more points along a continuum. That's fine too. So just allow the client to express whatever their levels happen to be. And again, you can do it by asking them questions. Maybe they're just spontaneously revealing it to you in the dialogue they're sharing with you. But you're going to get this sense. And if they say something like, oh no, that'll be a piece of cake, anyone who's saying that'll be a piece of cake is implying in just those words that they really are quite downgrade about it, that their level of ability is greater than the level of challenge that they perceive that activity is having. And again, just as a reminder, we talked about the difference between perceptions and reality. We work with perceptions. Perceptions do tend to change. Whether that perception is good, bad, right, or wrong doesn't really matter. People's perceptions impact their level of tension. We might help them to see reality such as it may be, to better understand it, accept it, etc. But nevertheless, everyone has those perceptions of what their reality may be. And by the way, all of us who are working with other people also have our own perceptions of whatever that reality is. We have to be very careful that we are not imposing our perceptions of their reality onto them. And so it's more about helping them to understand their perceptions and for you to understand their perceptions as well. So anyway, apathy occurs when someone's perceived level of ability greatly exceeds the level of challenge that they happen to be facing at that moment in time. Apathy sounds like this: do something. I don't need to do anything. Everything's just fine. Everything is a-okay. It's all under control. Everything is just fine. Now, again, they could be deluding themselves completely and totally, but if that's their perceptions, this is going to be their response. So do something. I don't need to do anything. Everything is really just fine. Now, the key word for apathy is spelling out whatever, a sleeping person sounds like: a nice little snore. The person who's in apathy is becoming less and less conscious of what's going on with whatever the situation is. They are paying less and less attention to whatever these situations happen to be. These situations are moving to the metaphorical back burner of their mind, and in many cases, it's no longer even on the stove. And so this is what's really happening. Apathy is a very low level of tension. There is a direct relationship between tension and attention. So down in apathy, these things are not getting very much attention whatsoever. The emotions that someone experiences down in apathy are of the unresourceful variety, but they are different emotions that we found up in stress. So in apathy, the emotions are, well, apathy is one of them, being apathetic about something, complacency, boredom, These emotions are distorting the person's reality, but instead of magnifying a problem, they may be minimizing the situation. So you think about people putting their head in the sand, all that sort of stuff, denying that there's things going on. These are all expressions of what may be going on with a person who's in apathy, even if that apathy is more of an avoidance behavior. You'll see this as we work our way through actual change grids. But pretty much they're bored, complacent, they're just weary about the whole situation, very tired. Reasoning abilities are emotionally ruled again, but those emotions that are ruling their reasoning is boredom and complacency. So we expect their decisions or the way they're figuring something out to be rather dull and slow, or more often than not, even when we're looking at decision making, they feel like I already made a decision. No decision needs to be made. I've already figured this out. This was figured out long ago. So they're kind of just dismissing it as being an issue that even merits any attention being put on it whatsoever. Now, in your work as coaches, you again, no doubt encountered many people who are very much down in apathy. And I'm not making a value judgment. I'm not saying that they are an apathetic person. I'm saying when it comes to this particular situation or this particular aspect of that situation, they're down in apathy. They just really don't care about it at this particular moment. They believe they've got all the resources they need, and then some. Resource availability is perceived as limitless. And when it comes to control, they're going to tell you with every word they utter, yeah, I'm in control. Absolutely everything's perfect. It's all totally fine. There's no problems, no worries, no nothing. But the problem is that that sense of control they're experiencing could very well be an illusion of control. An illusion of control means that for whatever reason, the way they're framing the situation is inaccurate. But based on the frame they've put around that situation, they view themselves as being in control. Sadly, the situation is not as they perceive it to be. So in reality, they are out of control. Let me give you an example of this so you can see how this is all connected. Years ago, my wife's father passed away. And he had been in hospice care for a while before this happened, and her mother, was already starting to show signs of vascular dementia, and we kind of knew that the care of Linda's mother would come to us, and we were certainly fine with that. But we needed to understand a few things about family finances, and so one of the things we asked Johnny, we said, Johnny, do you have a life insurance policy? He goes, well, of course I have a life insurance policy. I work for the Ford Motor Company for, on and on and on. And I was a union man. And so, there's a little bit of righteous indignation that the question was even asked. So we said, could we see it, please? And so there's a file folder, and he pulls it out, and he pulls out this little actual paper insurance document. And it was so old that you knew if you opened it up too quickly, it could just like rip along its seam, just fall apart right in front of you. It was true. Johnny did have a fully paid life insurance policy that was worth $10,000. Now he had other resources, so family ended up being just fine. But he was under the illusion that $10,000 was going to serve him as well at the age of 88 as it did when he was a young man starting his work with the Ford Motor Company. So, did he feel like he was in control? Absolutely. Was it actually, in reality, an illusion of control? That's right. Because of this little phenomenon. Here's the one of the real downsides. We'll get to more in a second with apathy, and that is that because apathy isn't very much tension, things that are in apathy don't get very much attention. They move further and further out of your conscious awareness to the point that they become elements that are purely in the subconscious level. So here's the problem. The world keeps changing, and people that are in apathy about particular issues don't notice those changes, and so they stop adapting to whatever the changes in whatever the environment is that's impacting whatever that issue happens to be. This happens all the time. So those who that are doing executive level coaching, there could be executives who about a particular issue had a point in time where they felt absolutely in control, totally on top of whatever that issue happens to be. And so it moved down grid for them. It moved down into apathy, and sooner or later it moved to that back burner or moved into their unconscious awareness. But the world kept changing, the situation kept changing, but they were paying attention to things that were causing them higher levels of tension, very normal, predictable thing, and something at the end of the day got ignored or got neglected or simply never showed itself as needing any attention. And nevertheless, changes continue to occur. Those changes weren't really noticed. And as much as this executive wants to say everything is just fine, we may know and others around the executive may know that that is absolutely not the case. And so very often we find ourselves trying to find some sort of practical, useful, diplomatic way of helping our clients to really see the reality, embrace the reality, accept the reality, and move forward based on whatever that reality happens to be. So there's an illusion of control, and then productivity is virtually non-existent. The sad part of that is that, well, you get a certain level of productivity from autopilot. So if the activity is one that is just humming along without anyone paying any really deliberate attention to it, you could still be getting a certain level of productivity that comes out of pure habit, pure routine, but don't expect to have any great grand leaps that would be happening in the levels of productivity or growth and development in any sort of way. It's virtually non-existent down in apathy. Now, I'm going to quickly describe the cues, but I want to get to those upside and downside. In fact, I'm going to give you a preview of them right now. I'll just say this. The worst thing about apathy, and the thing that I want all of you to always keep in mind, is that when we are looking at apathy, there's a very strong possibility that we are looking at untapped potential. Remember that to end up in apathy, the person has to have a level of ability, or again, perceive themselves as having a level of ability that greatly exceeds the challenge. So whatever that challenge was, when you first do something, the challenge is very high. You don't perceive your ability as being all that great because it's a brand new challenge for you. But as you start to work on that challenge and you start to succeed with that challenge, your level of ability is going up, the perceived level of challenge is going down, and sooner or later you hit a place of mastery. So mastery lives in apathy. Just let that soak in for a second. In fact, we say that apathy is the unavoidable side effect of mastery. So we're concerned that we've got all of this great knowledge and skill and experience, all these attributes of ability that are no longer being exercised. They're no longer being pulled into play at a level that would get the person re-engaged, that would help the person to apply all those great strengths to whatever the next phase is, or whatever the next goal is, their next issue happens to be. So whenever we are seeing someone who's in apathy, just know that we're looking at untapped potential. We're not judging the person ever. So apathy is a way someone happens to be responding to a situation. It is not an essential quality of their personality or temperament or any like that. I mean, maybe it could be, but more often than not, we really are just going like, no, this is just how they happen to be responding to this particular situation as they perceive it at this particular moment in time. Let me change the situation, let me change their perceptions, let me change the timing, and they could end up being someplace dramatically different on the change grid. But as long as they are down in apathy, there is a whole lot of tremendous potential that is not being tapped into. Now, those of you that are working with executives, you may often encounter an executive who is, or actually it's just anybody, but I do encounter it personally more when it comes to working with executives. These are people who have achieved something really great. They've had a wonderful track record to end up in the position that they're in. They have encountered, confronted, and dealt with countless challenges. And as a result, they really have mastered whatever it is they happen to be. Yet when we talk to them about their heart's truth, they communicate to us that they feel very underutilized, underchallenged, unstimulated, bored. Now, we often describe them as being trapped in a velvet prison. So a velvet prison is a very comfortable place. So they're making plenty of money. They're getting lots of kudos. They're well respected. They're well regarded. They seem to be getting all of those kind of rewards. But for whatever reason, they don't really satisfy them, whatever their drive is. How often do we find ourselves helping them to explore what's next in their life? What's next? What's the new challenge? So they can deploy those great skills at something that's going to help them get to an even greater level. So you may not have been aware of it, but every time you have encountered a client who's in apathy, you may very well be doing the sorts of things that are moving them upgrid out of apathy into a more purposeful, productive kind of place. Because as long as they continue to be in apathy, they will not put much change doesn't occur down in apathy. All right, Dave, thoughts, comments about what I've just shared there?
The one illustration I use a lot is that I never want my airline pilot to be in apathy.
Yeah, there you go. Or my surgeon, even my barber.
I want the ability high, but I want them to be a little more on their toes. So
Right, exactly, because things change in an instant. So pay attention, people, pay attention. All right, so anyway, apathy is something that we tend to deal with a lot of clients who are feeling as though they need a new mission, vision, purpose, trying to recreate themselves. A lot of that is the natural discussion that follows someone finding themselves in the apathy response state. Okay, so very quickly, what does apathy look like? Again, if you're looking at them, postures, gestures, expressions, breathing rate, it's higher. Their postures are draped. They become so heavy. They just drape themselves on furniture. They slouch. So their gestures are weak. It's like their hands are so heavy. Their limbs are so heavy. They can't even lift them up to gesture something to you. Their facial expressions, everything is droopy. Drooling is a really key indicator. Breathing rate is very slow. Their attire is sloppy, not because they're frantically involved with other things like they would be up in stress, but because they simply don't care. So down in apathy. Their
sounds like
tonal
Eeyore, T.
Yeah, like Eeyore. Yeah, it's very interesting. You can look at any well-written piece of literature, and in all likelihood, you're going to find characters who represent each of the different archetypes, if we're looking at any of the personality typing systems, and certainly any of these levels of productive tension. So yeah, Eeyore would definitely be our poster child, poster character for apathy. Tonal qualities, volume, tempo, pitch, affect, and inflection. Volume becomes very soft. Things get very quiet down in apathy. Tempo slows down. The pitch of someone's voice gets lower. Their ability to control an accent or display deliberate accent, they don't care, so they give up. So their natural affect, their natural accent comes on strong. Inflection of their voice becomes very flat and monotone. Their verbal cues, grammar, they don't care about, so grammar is pretty bad. Vocabulary becomes very small. Jargon and slang usage becomes very heavy. Lots of filler material, lots of hums and ahs and whatevers. And in fact, primal grunting returns. Lots of just primal kinds of vocalizations occur down in apathy. And then predicates, people tend to use words that imply their sense of touch is involved. They say things like, well, it's slow going. I'm between a rock and a hard place, or yeah, I'm feeling pretty mellow about this. It's going to be more kinesthetic feeling oriented, sensory feeling sorts of oriented words. We talked about
T,
yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, we have a question. Uh, might someone in apathy actually dress really well because that's something that makes them feel good?
The act of dressing well to feel good is an attempt for someone to self-manage their level of tension. That's actually a behavior of someone who is in power, who recognizes that they're being very bored and lazy and complacent, that might even feel or be aware that they are depressed. And so they go like, what can I do to get myself out of this state? And they then go and deliberately do something consciously, although they may not be fluent in the principles of tension management. All of us have a certain, I mean, I didn't invent it. This is something that was noticed. This is all these tension management behaviors are part of the full range of normal human behavior. We're just trying to help people do them more consciously, more deliberately. So that person in that moment said, nope, I'm going to get out of bed. I'm going to get myself cleaned up. I'm going to get myself ready to go out there in the world. And interestingly enough, as they go about consciously doing this power behavior, all kinds of other things about their mindset are changing as well, because suddenly if they're going to look the part, they're going to feel the part. As they start to move up to power physically, or in the case of the specific question about attire, all the other stuff associated with power comes along with it. So they do start seeing themselves with greater possibilities. They do start seeing themselves as having more confidence and more pride and all that. So sometimes, well, in Latin, there's a phrase, uh, vistus virum facit, which means clothes make the man. So clothes make the individual. Let's dress the part. You'll feel the part. You're more likely to act the part. So that was a long answer to the question, but there you
Yeah.
go.
Well, T, I think it's really important to remember that all this is very situational, right? So I'm
Yeah.
thinking of an executive, um, like a client executive that maybe it has a lot of things on his or her mind and doesn't seem in apathy at all. But when it comes to a certain project or issue, they're
Oh
they're
yeah.
they're down grid about it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
you may look at them and say, well, they don't seem like this. They don't seem like an Eeyore. Well, yeah, not about most things, but maybe about the issue at hand, they are.
Well, exactly. And so a very important point to always keep in mind is that the change grid is not a personality test. There's plenty of those out there. We don't need another one. Um,
Right.
the change grid just says, all I really want to know about, all I'm looking at right now is how is this person currently responding to the specific issue at hand in this particular moment, at this particular time? How is this person responding to that particular situation? Now, as Dave just pointed out, we do not have one and only one situation happening in our life. We have dozens, hundreds, perhaps countless situations, issues that are happening concurrently, simultaneously, and all of them exist on the change grid all at once, all in different places, scattered hither and yon. And as you look at more change grids, that will become abundantly clear to you. It's also going to give you a tremendous power as a human development professional, as a coach, to help the person to see how all these different situations are interacting with one another, and whether the way they're currently interacting with one another is working well, or what the challenges might be based on how they're currently plotting on the grid. So this becomes a very dynamic, very I keep saying powerful kind of tool. But as you learn this, we talk about it being looking at one issue, and someone's in apathy about a particular issue. At the moment they're in apathy about issue A, they could be up in stress about issue B and in power about issue C. And there's other places on the grid as well. So to Dave's example, how often are we dealing with managers who are frustrated because they are trying to get approval from the higher ups to do whatever needs to be done? Um, But while the higher up, the executive might be up in power or elsewhere, upgrade, power, stress, even stress, about a whole set of issues, they're in apathy about dealing with what this manager believes is absolutely mission critical at this point in time. How do we help that individual then to better manage their own level of tension and become more effective at helping the people who don't want to pay attention to something to take a moment and actually look at it. So life is tension management, business is tension management. So this is all going to be part of your ongoing training. And one other thing I'll throw out now is that at all times, someone is always managing someone else's level of tension, and the environment is managing your level of tension as well. Anyway, so it sounds like apathy is all downside, but there is an upside to apathy. Apathy is the place on the change grid where we can actually relax. It's the place on the change grid where we can actually rest. It's the only place on the change grid where we can get a good night's sleep. And so if we are trying to do good stress management, we're trying to um, um, find a better place for us to operate from, apathy may very well be a place we want to spend some time in. Now, it's not necessarily where the greatest work is done for someone deciding to move forward or to find that centered, balanced place, but it may be necessary right on. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's say someone has been in a crisis situation, here that is being up in stress for whatever the period of time happens to be, but it has left them feeling physically exhausted. Yet there needs to become some stabilized point. They need to return to a new normal. It may be necessary for them to move out of stress and down into apathy for a certain period of time for that physical rejuvenation to occur, for them to be able to rest, to remove themselves physically, emotionally, and intellectually from the issue. Take a mental vacation, but get away. So deliberately moving oneself down into apathy, so that after that healing has occurred, I can then say, all right, I'm ready. Let's move up to power now so that I can actually deal with the issue, come up with a solution that serves us well in the long run and prevents this chaos from happening again. So hopefully you just heard that there is benefit or in movement on the change grid. So we don't ever want to cast a value judgment about saying that any of these levels of tension are good, bad, right, or wrong. We just want to say, when it comes to this particular situation at this particular moment in time, where is this person, and where is the best place on the grid for this person to be about this activity, and then how do I go about managing that to help that happen. Okay, so there is an upside to apathy, rest assured. There you go. Even that was an indication of that. Um, okay, so let's take a look now at the little last points to know about apathy, and then we'll be done for today. We'll pick up where we left off next week. But apathy is the unavoidable side effect of mastery. I think that is such a valuable phrase for all coaches to understand and to share with their clients, particularly those of you who are operating a coaching practice that is not about some sort of an emergency room situation. So you have a client in crisis who just needs some coaching in the moment, some crisis coaching to help them get out of whatever this predicament happens to be, but instead coaching more as a wellness center, where you have people who have kind of lost their mojo, or are starting to slip into one of these downgrids level of tension. So they've really done well where they're at. And the question is, what are they going to do next before they have this situation arise where they're down in apathy and everything becomes boring for them? What can we do as an intervention before that happens? Or even better, when we're working with our clients long term, as a preventative mechanism, so that people don't end up in apathy or downgrade where productivity suffers. How can we work with our clients on an ongoing basis to help them always grow and then use that growth to decide what the next wave of growth is going to be. So what we're doing then is saying, let's never achieve mastery long enough for it to become a detriment to our future, our forward movement to our future. Let's instead conquer whatever the challenges that's in front of us, do a brief celebration that mastery in the moment has occurred, and then say, okay, now what? Now what? Now what is a plea for identifying the next level of tension, the next level of challenge that will, again, stimulate my level of tension to remain in a productive place. Uh, One thing we often say to our clients is that it is much easier to keep yourself out of apathy than it is to get yourself out of apathy. Apply that to working with other people. It is much easier to keep a team out of apathy than it is to get them out of apathy. So if I'm talking to you as managers and a corporate client, I can say, look, you can develop strengths, skills in two different abilities. Would you rather get good at getting people out of apathy, or rather get good at keeping people out of apathy? I promise you, it's a lot of work to get people who have been in apathy and have locked themselves down there to ever move out of it. Now, next time we talk about, we'll be talking about the two hybrid response states. So we talked about stress, power, and apathy, the one at the top, middle, and bottom of the change grid. What about these two in the middle? How do they impact human behavior, and where do you pull them into play? So before we end, Dave, any questions, comments from anybody?
No, we're all good.
Okay, great. So we'll pick up where we left off on the next call. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.